Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 121 of the podcast. In this episode, I talk with Annette Safstrom, and we talk about her book, Sustainable Children's Ministry. Many of you, if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, might remember the conversation I had with Anthony Prince a while back. He and Annette both work for Ministry Architects, and there's the book, Sustainable Student Ministry, Sustainable Youth Ministry, that some of you may be familiar with. So this is in that same vein. That podcast episode with Anthony Prince was one of the most popular because we talked about staffing ratios, budgets, volunteer ratios, like what are some benchmarks for children's and student ministry. So we kind of dive into that conversation again here with Annette, though it's focused on children's ministry. So you're going to love this interview today. Before we jump into that, though, there's two things I want to tell you about. One, many of you know, we kind of kicked this off actually with the interview with Anthony, but I did a survey that's still active and running of churches. Over 1,000 churches have participated in it now about staffing. So Ministry Architects has their benchmarks, and you'll hear about that in the interview here with Annette. But that survey basically asks about attendance, volunteers for kids ministry and student ministry. So if you want to know, okay, what do other churches my size have on average in terms of staff, in terms of even kids attendance and even volunteers, that survey is something you're going to want to check out. It was 600 churches that took the original version. So if you get the data that's going to be based on that original 600, I'm going to update it here soon. And if you download it, you'll get the updated version now that we have over 1,000 that have taken it. But the original, pool of people, 600 churches, was so good that I don't expect the data to change all that much. But I think it's really helpful because a lot of times, we do it based on gut feeling, right? Like I don't think we have enough volunteers per kid, or usually that one you can see easily, or I think we have too little staff, or I don't know, is it just right? Or I'm not sure. And the reality is churches are all over the place. You'll see that. You can see that in the survey results. Some churches literally have 4 times the staff that another church the same size might have. But what's helpful is the averages. So if you want to get that, we'll link that in the show notes. And then also, we just wrapped up a month basically of people registering for courses with Ministry Boost and even coaching with our partnership with Orange. Well, the courses are, the registration's done. That's going. They're kicking off here. But the coaching with Orange and YouLead, they've extended that a month. So there's a lot of people signed up, and we're doing some things in October with those people that already signed up. But you might want to check that out as well. Even if you're not going to do the coaching, we're doing 3 more tribe conversations, meaning we're going to have a video call just for preschool ministry leaders, elementary ministry leaders, and student ministry leaders over the next 2 weeks. And you'll want to check that out for sure. And then we also have, if you're thinking about signing up for coaching with Orange, there's a webinar that's coming up in the middle of the month with all the Orange coaches. And then at the end of the month, I think the 24th, anybody that is registered for coaching with Orange will be part of a Q&A with Kara Powell, which is going to be a lot of fun. So they've extended the registration for that till October 31st, but you'll want to register earlier if you're interested in coaching to get those other bonus webinars and Q&A with Kara and all that stuff. But we'll put links to all of that in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 121. Let's go ahead now, though, and listen to my conversation with Annette Safstrom. Today I'm joined by Annette Safstrom. Welcome to the podcast, Annette.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump in and talk about the book and Kidmin measurables and metrics and recruiting and all this fun stuff that I think everybody's going to want to listen to.
Yeah, I have been in children's ministry for most of my life, which sounds kind of funny, but my story starts, I grew up in a children's ministry that was really growing and thriving, and it's where I first experienced a connection with the Lord. And so when I was kind of aging out of the children's ministry, my children's pastor, Miss Jenny, came up to me and she handed me a piece of paper and she said, "Here, I think you can do this. Come back next week. You're going to teach kindergarten."
Nice.
And I was 11.
Early. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I was 11. And I don't know if I would have done that with an 11-year-old. I mean, she was kind of old in that. And, but she spent time with me. She really coached me on how to lead kids in a relationship with the Lord and how to teach them the Bible. And I mean, even through high school, college, grad school, she spent time with me for a lot of those years once a month. And we would just talk about kids ministry and how it works and what we should be doing and things like that. And so I grew up knowing that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And so that's kind of unusual because I think most people get into children's ministry accidentally. And so my path was a little bit different. And so fast forward a lot of years, when I had just gotten married, I got my first full-time job in children's ministry. And so I thought, okay, this is it. Like, this is what I was born for. This is what I was trained for. I am stepping into the Lord's will for my life. And I walked into this church as a full-time elementary directing coordinator and realized that church work is not what I thought it was.
You're probably not alone. You're probably not alone in that feeling, right?
Right. We think that when we go to work for a church, we're going to pray, we're going to live in the Lord's joy, and we're going to teach kids about Jesus, and that's all we're going to do. And what I found out was that the church is full of people.
And people are amazing and messy, right?
Right. We all bring our mess into the church with us. And so, it's kind of like all our messiness started bumping into each other. And, I came in all wide-eyed and naive and positive, and I realized this is not as pretty as I thought it was going to be. And so, I spent a few months being pretty devastated by the way people were talking to me and treating me and how, I was expected to come into this big church with these systems for ministry. And I walked into the church thinking, this is a big established church. They've got some systems for ministry. I'm just going to walk into this and start using their systems. And so we were both assuming that the other had something that we didn't. So, yeah, and it was rough because we both lived in that assumption for a while, and my supervisors were looking at me like, why can't you get this together? Why are you struggling with basic things like you don't have sign-in sheets on a Sunday? And I was thinking, why is this so hard? Why are we spinning our wheels? And, why are we doing more work than we have to do, changing our plan for Sunday on Friday afternoon? Why? So the systems were they were non-existent on both ends.
Yeah, you were probably thinking, hey, this church has been around. Why don't you have sign-in sheets for?
Exactly. I was like, why is there not a system for this? And why is this thing that's so simple? Why is it difficult? And so, those lack of systems led to a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of hurt on both sides. And so I spent a few years in that role, and I got to a place where I was kind of forced to develop my own systems. And then I did, and we had a rhythm and things like that. And so I kind of learned out of necessity that I've got to figure this out. I've got to have some systems or I'm going to get fired. I mean, there was a point at which I was sat down in my boss's office and they said, you've got to get it together. Or you're not going to be here long. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've been to Bible college. I've got degrees. I've been mentored and trained. How is this happening? And it all came down to the systems. And so kind of, it was sink or swim. And so I had to figure it out. And thankfully I was able to figure that out. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'd love for you to tell us, because I want to jump in and talk about some of the topics. And this story that you just kind of told is in the book. So I'd love it if you could tell us about the book and about your work with ministry architects. And then we can jump in and talk about, some of the things that you talk about in the book.
Sure. So the book is called Sustainable Children's Ministry, and I had come across Ministry Architects when it was called Youth Ministry Architects, and it was a company that was solely focused on supporting youth workers and their ministries and giving them the systems that they needed for ministry. And I had come across and had talked to a couple of people, and they had said, hey, some churches want us to do the same thing with children's ministry. Do you want to come and help us? So I did, and what we learned was there are a lot of similarities between the systems you would set up for running a successful youth ministry and the ones you would set up for a successful children's ministry. But there are some significant differences in kind of what the key, like the fatal flaw might be in youth ministry and what it might be in children's ministry. They're completely different. They're actually, I think they're opposite. And so we spent a little time in Ministry Architects kind of wrestling about how we approach children's ministry and how we approach the systems. What we learned is that while in youth ministry, the fatal flaw, if you could say, is kind of the youth ministers, if I can stereotype, are a little more laid back and not as hands-on and not as anxious and worried about some of the details. Whereas the children's ministry people, by personality type, we seem to be more control freak-ish and more like, we want it all done right and our way. And, nobody can do it the way we can. And I'm in that camp as well. So our results are the same, but our approach is different in those two things. So, in children's ministry, we got to have a system for recruiting our volunteers, and we got to have our database has got to be up to date, and it's got to be right. And we've got to have a plan for reaching out to people. And we've got to know what's coming up on the calendar, but it's in a completely different kind of vein than the way we approach youth ministry. In children's ministry, we're really focused on how are we going to get a team to work together to do this ministry, and how are we going to share the ministry with a leadership team and not be hoarders of the ministry.
Yeah, and I think even that is true in youth ministry too. Now, I would say, generally speaking, the way I say it is, having spent time in both worlds, and my job is kind of leading both areas, you can get by with less volunteers in youth ministry because the kids are older, and if you don't have small groups especially, you can have more of them in a room with, not that you want to, but you can. Whereas in children's ministry, oftentimes, even if you have a smaller church, you probably have a few different rooms. And you can't be in every room, and you can't have one volunteer be in every room. So you automatically need more volunteers. You need more volunteers per kid just for good, safe ratios and all of that stuff. So I think even the recruiting that is still needed on the youth ministry side. Maybe though that's an area where you don't feel it as much, right? Whereas in children's ministry, maybe you feel it more because you can't be in two places at once. So if that volunteer doesn't show up, somebody's got to go in there. It can't be you. So in terms of the book, tell us a little bit about the book, because there is Sustainable Youth Ministry, and that that book is out, and obviously Sustainable Children's Ministry is similar. Tell us about maybe some of the differences with this book.
So some of the differences are in Sustainable Youth Ministry. Mark talks about the superstar mentality, where, the youth pastor is all things to all kids. And, and it's kind of like the bent of the youth minister is, building relationships with every kid. And his advice there is to start building a network of people who are going to build a relationship with your teenagers. In children's ministry, the main parable is the workhorse. So it's kind of where we begin, is talking about this workhorse. And as a children's minister, it's my bent to say, I can do that. Oh, you need that picked up? I can do that. Oh, I need to order goldfish. I can do that. Oh, we need more diapers in the nursery. I can go get those. Oh, we need to cut out these things. I can do that. Oh, the teacher's not going to show up. I can do that. And so we've done that to the point where we're up at 4 a.m, cutting out little lammies, and somebody else could have done that. And so the bent is not necessarily the same kind of delegation as it is in youth ministry, but it's, okay, we can all be in this together. I don't have to be up at 4 a.m. doing this, because there's somebody who's got plenty of time to do that on a Tuesday afternoon. And so that's kind of the main difference is, as children's ministry people, we're kind of just piling on more work on ourselves because it's simple and we can, but we really can't. And so in the book, there's a story, the parable of the workhorse. And what happens to this horse is she started out as this beautiful thoroughbred. And in the end, she's just tired and wants to take a nap. And she's beat down and she doesn't want to do the thing anymore. And that's kind of what we've seen over and over in children's ministry is, as children's ministers, we've taken on so much little bitty things that we're tired and we're worn out and we're beat down, and we started to take things personally that aren't personal. And there's this whole emotional journey that goes along with that workhorse mentality that we feel like nobody understands what I do. And guess what? They don't, because you didn't tell them.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. And they haven't done it. And that's just a reality. Like, we don't, if you've never been a lead pastor, you don't understand that. at all, right? So it's understandable that your lead pastor doesn't understand your job, because if they've never done that. And I've even found if they haven't done it in a long time. So maybe they were a student pastor or a children's pastor at one point in their life. But if it's been 5 or 10 years, you forget so much, and understandably, because now you have this whole new thing that you have to remember and be all about. So I love the Sustainable Youth Ministry book. I love this book as well, Sustainable Children's Ministry. It's a great angle, just the idea that, man, it is hard to run the race in ministry and not burn out unless you have key things in place. And that, you're right, it happens all the time, where it's like that workhorse mentality. I call it like the Pied Piper in student ministry.
Yeah.
Where you're doing everything, and it's just tough because children's and student ministry both in some ways are like small churches. They have their own large group experiences, worship gatherings, what do you want to call it? They have their own small group and discipleship and volunteers and staff and budgets. What I mean? It's just shrink down what you do for the church, and you do the same entire thing for kids and student ministry. And one of the things I know people long for when they're leading their ministry is to know, is it healthy, or is this okay? Is this working? In children's ministry, a lot of times you'll hear about ratios for volunteers, meaning like how many per kid in a room. One volunteer for every 2 kids in the toddler room or whatever. But in this book, and even in Sustainable Youth Ministry, you all have some ratios, some measurables that you have, landed on or learned from working with so many churches. And I'd love to talk through those. People will be interested. We'll have to they involve numbers. So those of you that are listening, if you don't like numbers, we'll try to make it as clear as we can. But I'd love to talk through some of those so people can think about their own ministry and think, okay, where am I in relation to this? So tell us about the measurables, and then let's jump into the budget one maybe first. It's probably the one that might be the most shocking, I think, when people hear it. So tell us about the measurables, and then let's talk budget.
Sure. And I think the budget measurable probably is the most shocking to people, some, but not everyone. First I'll say a little bit about how we got to these, we call them norms. Ministry Architects has worked with over 800 churches. And so in that, we've been able to gather some data and spent a little time crunching those numbers. And we just wanted to know kind of what's the norm? Where are people falling in these certain things? And so for budget, after we crunched some numbers, we came at that the norm for children's ministry budget is $1,000 per kid per year.
And so people were like, what? $1,000? I have $1,000 and I've got 50 kids. No, I'm just kidding. You know what I mean? Like some people are thinking, what? But explain what that means. What's the budget part?
So I have to go back a little bit to how we count our kids, because it's there's so many ways to count kids. You could say we've got a weekend and a midweek program, and we have 50 kids weekend and 50 kids midweek, so we have 100 kids. Well, you really don't have 100 kids. You have some kids who are going to both programs. And so what we really have worked hard to do was count unique faces in a week. So you may have 75 regular attenders, but you only see 50 different faces in a week. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, is that unique faces in a week? Is that more like an average, or like, for example, we all know people are attending church less frequently. So if an average kids attendance, like imagine like our church, we only have one weekly program, right? So there's no way that kids are showing up. We have multiple services, and some kids are there for multiple services, but we only count them one time. So if we get 250 kids on a week, we know there's 400 kids probably that regularly attend our church, meaning like at least once a month or something like that. Do you mean the 400 who attend sometime in the month, or the 250 average?
Right. We mean the 250 average. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to compare weekend worshiping attendance with the number of kids who attend. So we're just counting attendance.
Yeah. So average. And that is helpful, I think, because you know the average. It's hard to say, well, how many come in a month? I mean, you can kind of figure it out if you take attendance a certain way, but average is probably more helpful.
Right. So average was a good number to land on. And, we all feel different ways about that, but we just thought that was the most usable number for us. And so let's say we've got 50 kids average attending in a week, and we're not counting anybody twice now. Then the norm for that budget would be a $50,000 budget for your children's ministry year. Now, that includes staff salaries and benefits as well. So there's something in there too.
Mm-hmm. And that's the part that probably people miss or why it sounds so large. Because it's not ministry budget, which most people think of what I get in a year to spend on the ministry. It's that plus staff salaries, expenses, and not even just you, but even if there's like other staff or part-time help or something like that, right?
Right. And what we wanted to measure was how many dollars is the church putting towards ministering to children? And so and the only thing that we don't include in that number is if a church pays their nursery workers. We don't include that in the number, and it's only because we couldn't compare apples to apples if we did that. There's so much variance in that, some churches have all volunteers, some churches pay a lot for that, some churches, pay teenagers for that. So
sure,
we left that out.
So leave that out if you're calculating for your own church. It's basically your budget for the year that you get to spend on the ministry, plus all personnel costs related to that ministry. So it's not even just salary. I mean, it's benefits, whatever, depending on how your church does these different things. It's really those two things, or am I missing a third?
No, it's just those two things. And one of the things that isn't really inherently obvious in that is that, let's say your choir director is spending 10 hours a week with, doing kids stuff, then we pull that number into that as well. So we pull, part of that person's salary into that. So yeah, it's exactly what you said. All the money that's going towards children's ministry.
So if people think about 50 kids, $50,000, it's very possible there's somebody's listening and they have 50 kids attending on average at their church in a week, and they're working, 30 hours a week. And so if they add up the numbers, you're like, you know what? I'm 40,000. So I'm not 1,000 per kid. I'm 800 a kid if I did that math right. That's normal though, right? That's the average. So like people are going to be higher, people are going to be lower.
Right. That's normal. And I think we got to be real careful about it too. And we use it as a measure. So here's let's say, people call ministry architects to come in. We kind of run all their numbers. And if they say, we're feeling pain here and we're feeling pain here, and we run the numbers and we say, you're way below the norm on this, that might be where the pain's coming from. But if there's no pain, we're not going to worry about the numbers as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Because you might find a church where it's like, and somebody listening may calculate, and you're like, man, we're actually half that. We're 500, a kid. But if it's healthy and it's working, and maybe they're just getting there a different way, or maybe it's like so volunteer driven, the volunteers are carrying a lot of the weight that staff would carry, so that saves money. Or maybe the other thing I think about too is programming. If your church runs 2 programs a week for kids, it's going to be more. You're going to need more money. You're going to need more money, more staff, more volunteers. If you run 3, even more. So I think that's why it's helpful. It is a good guide, but hopefully nobody gets lost in that number and thinks something's definitely wrong or whatever. That's helpful.
It's a good guide, and then you also have to think about if you're in Seattle, that number is going to be different than if you're in Lubbock, Texas.
True. Yeah, and there's a difference too of I think Maryland is actually the highest average income state now, which is just crazy. But because we're not like California, you know what I mean? It's not like houses are so expensive, but that's not all of California. That's just certain parts. And but at the same time, it's not like the South up here church-wise. So it's not like you have lots of churches or lots of big churches and lots of people have been in church for a long time and tithe. You don't. So it's this weird combination of high expensive area, but it's not like we're higher in average giving in churches in our state, So that's going to make a difference. When I look at a church, maybe that might be in a different state that maybe is more churched, even though the average income's lower. They could have higher giving and therefore higher budgets. It's possible.
True. And I want to caution people, if you're listening and you're thinking, I'm going to go talk to my pastor tomorrow and talk to him about this number. Don't do that. Because the things like that take time. Change like that takes time. Now, if you're feeling pain in a certain area, then look at that and see, is it related to budget? And are there steps along the way? Lots of churches that I've gone into, maybe they were really below that number, and you just can't get there in a day or a week or sometimes a year. You might need to kind of talk to your pastor about why you're feeling the pain and what these numbers mean, and make a plan to get where you think you should be with the money.
Yep. Well, let's talk about some of the other ones, because I know one of the things that I learned from Sustainable Youth Ministry book, and I'm sure it's the same with children's ministry and all the work you all do at Ministry Architects, is that we're going to talk budget and staff, volunteers, and even attendance. It's kind of like if you look at budget and the staff and the volunteers, you got three things. You really need, can you get two of them to be good? Can you get two of those to be in a good spot? And if you can do that, then one of them can be off, I don't want to say off the mark, but it can be lower, and that's okay. Because you can probably carry it. The other two things make up for that third one. So what's a good staff benchmark for kids ministry?
So the benchmark that we found for kids ministry is one full-time person for every 75 average attending. So it's that same average attendance number, and then one full-time staff. And it was funny when I first came across that number, I was like, well, I don't like that at all. Why do the youth get one for 50 and we get one for 75?
Yeah.
But as you said before, children's ministry is a little more volunteer heavy. And so there's that aspect to that as well.
Yeah, I think, just again, in my having served in both worlds and having both of those ministries part of my job now, I do think you need more staff per student in student ministry. Mm-hmm. But I also think that's true from even I wouldn't say the ratio is the same. You don't need more volunteers per student in student ministry. You do need higher engagement. Like the older a child gets, the more like in our church, we have small groups for kids and students from like age 3 all the way up through high school. And the small group leader of the 4-year-old does not have to give as much time a week as the small group leader for the 11th grader. It's not even comparable. The 11th grader, and that's okay. It's just different. They're at a different season of life. There's more investment outside the church. There's trips and retreats that don't happen. So I think that's just true of staff too, where it's like, it's harder to lead as many students as it is kids because you are trying to show up more, outside their life. There's usually other things going on with trips and retreats that you'll have events with kids ministry. It's a big deal. But in some ways in student ministry, it's different. So 1 to 75 full-time equivalent, right? Like, a lot of people listening, they're part-time or they've got multiple staff, or maybe it's like one full-time and a part-time. Yeah. The idea being you can just add it up. Like if it was me and a 20-hour part-time person, we're 60 hours combined, right?
Right.
And then take our total average kids attendance and divide that by that 60 hour. Or no, I guess you have to divide it by
the
1.5.
75.
Now we're all confused with the numbers.
Right.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Take say I have 300 kids, divided by 75 is 4. I should have 4 full-time equivalent staff.
Right.
Okay, and so if you start, that probably is the better way to start. I was starting like the staff you have, to figure that out. That's probably harder. So you start with the ratio, 300 kids divided by 75 equals 4 full-time staff. And again, maybe it's not 4 full-time staff. Maybe it's 2 full-time and 3 part-time or whatever. But it adds up to that number. I think that would be helpful.
Right. And so if you're feeling like, okay, I've been hired for 30 hours a week and I'm working 80, one of two things is at work there. Either you are not staffed appropriately or you're not delegating the things that you should be delegating, and you're not structuring your ministry volunteers in a way that they should be.
It's probably both, quite honestly. Rarely do I see one or the other, right?
Right. Yeah, it usually is both. And then sometimes, as a children's director, you're going to run into a brick wall and your staffing committee is going to say you can't have any more staff. Then you've got to go back and figure out, okay, how am I going to structure this ministry so that I'm not working 80 hours a week, but we're still accomplishing the mission of the ministry.
Yep. That's good. What about, because I've done a staff survey actually that I'll probably link in the show notes here that a lot of people have taken now. And man, if there's one thing you learn from it, it's just the ratios are all over the place. There's a church, there are churches literally that it's 1 to 200. Now they're usually bigger, so there's some scale factor going on there. There's churches that are like, they got one full-time equivalent for every 30, 40 kids. It's like 100 kids come and they got 2 full-time staff, and a lot of people listening are thinking, I would love that. Like, how do I get that? So I'm guessing you've seen that too, where it's just all over the place.
Yeah, it is all over the place. The thing about children's ministry is it's so passion driven, and I think another thing about children's ministry is that I like to say it's like housework. If nobody notices until it's not done. And so until there's a problem, nobody's really paying attention that, oh, you need more staff. Oh, you need more, and so, a lot of times we'll just take on the work as children's ministers and say, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. It's that same thing. and not complain about it. And so we've got one staff person for 300 kids. Now, and there are ways to make things like that work too. I do have to say though, multi-site is a different animal, and I don't have good numbers for that yet. So I just want to throw that out there that if you're in a multi-site and you're getting some central service support, I think the numbers will run a little differently.
Yeah, and I would add that, well, at the very least, I would add the central staff in and do a total. So I think that at the very least, you should look at like all your campus hours combined, plus the central, and then do the math. Because you can't just do your campus because you are getting help from central.
Right.
The other thing I would say is, and this is true of other churches, if you're a smaller church or if you're the campus of a church and it's smaller, because a lot of times churches will be very intentional. They'll hire a full-time children's person and they may only have 50 kids. Mm-hmm. That's okay. They're intentionally hiring a full-time person with the idea that we're going to grow this, to the point where it's 75 kids or maybe it's 100 kids, with that same full-time person. It's probably wrong to assume, hey, I'm the full-time person now. There's this many kids. Let's say there's 50. So, if we can grow it to 75, we need to hire more. It's like, not really. Like, you're probably a little overstaffed if you're full-time and you have 50 kids. Now somebody who is in that scenario is probably, yelling at me on their side of the conversation because they're so busy. That's the part where it gets messy. It's like, I haven't met anybody that's like, regardless of whether you're overstaffed or understaffed based on this number, I've met very few people that are like, oh yeah, I'm overstaffed. Like, take some away from me. You know what I mean? Everybody feels like I need more help. How about the volunteer number? What's the good ratio there?
So, a lot of children's ministry people don't like this number because it's not specific, but it's kind of the best we did with, an overall number. We would like one volunteer for every 5 weekly attending kids. And so I know the first thing people want to say to me is, but the nursery, right? Yeah. So if you have 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 in your nursery, that's great. By the time you get up to 4th and 5th grade, you may have 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. Yep. But kind of as an average, we've seen healthy ministries with a 1 volunteer to 5 kid ratio.
And another thing that comes up is, a lot of children's ministry people have some type of rotation of volunteers. Uh-huh. You mean that week? Like if you have 100 kids, divide that by 5, you should have 20 volunteers there that week for those 100 kids. So if you serve every other week, now you need 40 volunteers. Or if you serve once a month, now you need 80, right? I mean, like you want, the ratio is about that week, not just total on your team.
Right. These are just weekly numbers. So it's not even speaking to how you rotate your volunteers. It's just speaking to who's there on a weekend.
Yeah. And that makes sense. You'll have 1 to 2 in the nursery, like you said, and 1 to 10 maybe in elementary. And so that's how they'll kind of make up for each other. And then there's even like, you count, I'll call it like midweek or administrative volunteers, not midweek like for a program, but they edit curriculum at home during the week. They do resources on Thursday. That still counts. Right.
We would still count those because they're,
So those are three benchmarks: budget, staff, volunteers. The fourth one is attendance. Tell us about, in terms of when you work with churches, what's like a healthy percentage for kids' attendance versus the overall church?
Sure. This is a tricky one too. So the norm that we found is 15% of the worshiping congregation is kids. So it falls around to 15%. So if you have 100 people come into your church on Sunday, 15 of those would most likely be kids.
And if you have less, probably not great. If you have more, but again, we'll talk about the different contexts. But that's the idea. If you have 10, that's pretty light. If you have 25, hey, that's great. You probably just have a good percentage of your church's young families, right?
Right. But I've been in churches where it was 40, and the thing that number tells you is here's what the norm is, and so here's what we can expect to be normal. But like in the area I live in, it's very suburban, it's very family. It's going to be way above that 15%. But what that number tells you is that we've got to do some things a little differently and a little specifically geared towards having a larger percentage of kids. That means financially we've got to do that. Volunteer-wise, we've got to structure our programming that way. So that's what the number tells you. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. And there's definitely different contexts. Before we started recording, like I mentioned, my friend Nina Schmidgall, who's at National Community Church with Mark Batterson. They're in the D.C., multi-site, setting up in different venues throughout D.C. Like it's young adult, single, working class professionals. I mean, that's a huge percentage of their population. So they're not going to have a high percentage of kids attending. There's just not that high percentage of kids, period, in the areas that they reach. And that's okay. Or if your church is just younger, or maybe it's a church plant and it's very new and a lot of the people are in their 20s and young 30s, it's not going to be the same. Or if like your church, where it's more suburban, far more families, or even like I know churches where they have different campuses, and the ones like in the city, very low percentage kids. One's kind of like on the edge, and it's like pretty even, maybe 20, 22% kids. And then there's one that's like in the suburbs or almost rural. So there's more kids per family, right? And now they have 30% kids. So I think it's important for people to know the context, but I think it is a good gauge of like, okay, if we have below 15%, and in my experience too, unless your context is that we just don't have a lot of kids like in the community, in my experience, if it's below 18, I would be worried, for our church, where we are, because our community is families. So if we couldn't get to 18%, I would think we're not representing the community. You know what I mean? Like something's off here. So that's another gauge people could probably look up in census data or something, what their area looks like.
Right. And that's totally true. I've gone into churches where they're really discouraged because they only have 4 or 5 kids. But then, we were able to say, look at your community. So if you really want more kids, then let's make some strategies for bringing in the families that are in your community. Yep,
that's good. So those are 4 measurables or norms that you talk about. And obviously, again, just want to emphasize that, every church is going to be a little bit different and context matters. But the budget, staff, and volunteers, I guess one question is, can you get 2 of those to a pretty healthy spot? And the answer, and I know most people listening are like, well, I don't have much control over the budget or the staff. You know what I mean? Like, that's not my decision. So can you get the volunteer thing, work hard to get the volunteer number up, because that will make up for both of the other 2, in my experience. They'll make up for both the other 2. So I'd love to talk about recruiting volunteers. You have a great process in the book that I think is probably used far too infrequently, with leaders. So walk us through like what a good recruitment plan could be so we could grow our team.
Sure. I like to say about recruiting that recruiting is so simple, but it is not easy.
True.
And it's not rocket science. It's just what Mark DeVries would say is, if volunteers are your biggest problem, how come you're not spending 1 to 2 hours a week working on that problem? And we're not, because we don't like to be rejected. We don't like people to tell us no. It doesn't feel good. And so before I kind of dive into the steps, I think I want to kind of give a little context. I feel like a lot of times we get to the point where we have that desperate tone in our voice when we're talking to people, and they know. Like, nobody wants to be invited into a sinking ship.
Yeah. It's going down, but could you jump on and help bail some water out? That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Exactly. Like, where do I don't feel like I'm giving value at that point. And I don't feel like you wanted me specifically. I feel like you just wanted somebody to plug a hole. And we get to that point. And so, we're going to change our mindset a little bit into, we're inviting people into their own ministry. And we really are. And there are people in your church who are praying for a way to get involved, and they don't know that children's ministry is that place. And so, we've got to kind of paint the picture for them and invite them into something specific. So I'll start with the steps, and then I'll give a little more about inviting them into something specific. But the first thing that we say to do is, well, first we want to pray and get the Lord involved in our process. And then start early. And I know if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already in the midst of treading water. And so starting early may not be an option right now. But when the churches that I'm working with, we start recruiting for fall in February, March. And that's because people are planning their fall in the spring. And what we have to get involved with is so important. We want to get on their radar early. So we start early, and then we're going to make a list of our needs, which is is just painful, I'll be honest. Making a list of needs is painful because it's like looking at the scale on January 2nd. You're like, oh, wow, I have so far to go. So we start out and list them all out, not in your head, in a little spreadsheet or on a list. This is, I need these many teachers for this class each week of the month, and just start with that. And then once you've got your list of needs, you know exactly what you need. So I'm going to need these people. Then I go back to who was volunteering last year and I say, do you want to continue next year? And I'll fill their name in when they say yes. Yes, I want to continue. And I want to say this about asking if they want to continue next year. Our bent is just to assume when someone says yes, they're in it for life.
Well, yeah,
they are not.
You don't have to recruit them again. Right?
Right.
Not worry about that so I can focus on this.
But here's what happens is that person is volunteering. And every week someone's thinking, is this my last week? Is this my last week? I can't tell them. I don't want to tell them yet. And by the time they tell me, hey, I'm ready to quit, they're saying, Annette, this is my last week. Oh my goodness, where does that leave me? I got 6 days to find and train someone to take their place. So No. And then I'm in a panic all the time because it's happening on a rotating basis, right? It's not just one person. It just keeps happening. So if we say, okay, I'd love to have you September through May or whatever, however you want to structure your year, they know that you're going to ask them in February or March, hey, are you in it for next year? And if they say no, that's really okay because you have 6 months to find someone. So once we've made our list, then our list of needs, we're going to make another list. I like to call it a fishing pond. It's a list of prospective volunteers. So here's the thing I find the most with that list is we've already asked everyone we know, right? And so who are we going to put on this list? And so we're going to start sourcing our list, if I can use that word. We're going to start asking people, hey, who do you know that would be a great faith mentor for kids? Not who would be good volunteer. We're going to really describe it in ministry terms because that's what we're going for. I would ask parents, hey, who would you like to have mentor your kids in their faith? And take note and ask why. Why are you choosing David as a mentor? And take note of why. And then put him on your list, make a little note of why. And then when you get to the calling part, you're going to say, hey, several parents mentioned your name as a good mentor for kids. I would love to talk to you about an opportunity to do that. Sounds a whole lot different than, can you please come into Tim's class? We have a biter and no volunteers anymore, and I don't know what to do. So we start filling our list. Ask the kids, especially your 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, hey, what adults do you think are cool? And add them to your list. And then your other volunteers. Hey, do you know anybody that started coming to the church that, is solid in their faith and would be a great mentor or who's good with kids? And just start building your list. If you have a church directory, get it out and start flipping through the pages. And you will remember people that served 10 years ago who are still in your church and will be a great volunteer. It's amazing, like when I'll sit down with a church group and we'll go through their directory and they'll say, we're not going to come up with 75 names, Annette. And by the time we're done, they had 85 because they looked through the directory and they remembered people that they hadn't been thinking about. So you'll do all that. And we kind of have a ratio that we like to have in our fishing pond. So if you need 10 volunteers, you're going to want to have 30 names on your list because guess what? People say no. So when you call the first person and you ask them and they say no, you don't get that desperate tone in your voice yet because you have 2 more people to ask for that position. Mm-hmm. So once you've got your list of needs and then you've got your fishing ponds and you've got the names that you need, and if you have trouble filling it, just keep going back and asking people. Ask your senior pastor. Ask other staff members. Go ahead and get that filled. Then you're going to merge your lists. And what that means is, first you're going to go in your fishing pond and you're going to rank people. Don't make this a public document. You're going to rank the people that you think this would be my dream team. You're going to go put an A next to their name. They would be your A team. Like if you could get everybody you wanted to say yes, they're your A's. And then the ones that you're like, they'd be pretty good, but they're not necessarily my A team, put a B next to their name.
The B team.
The B team. We're not going to tell them they're the B team. We're not going to tell anyone this. And then if you're like, well, they'll do in a pinch, then put a C next to their name. Again, don't publish this document. Then you're going to have another section on your fishing pond, and we like to use the acronym WEB, W-E-B. They are either going to be great with the kids, behind the scenes, or either one. So then you're going to say, okay, Tom would be great, but maybe he's just not with the kids. Maybe he's, the snack guru or something like that. So you kind of list that how you want them. And then once you've got all that, look through it, kind of see what you've got, and then go back to your list of needs. And you're going to start putting names next to each need. And you're going to put your top choice next to each one. You see, you've already done a lot of work. You've spent a lot of hours, and you haven't made one phone call yet. So you're going to put people in there, and you're going to say, okay, these are the people I'm going to ask first. And then once you've got that, you start contacting people. There are lots of ways to contact people and lots of reasons. And I'm just going to tell you right now, it doesn't matter. Just start contacting people. Sometimes people want to call them and talk to them in person, but then by the time we get to call, it's dinner time. Oh, I'm not going to call them now because they won't answer. Blah, blah, blah. And so we talk ourselves out of it. And so I'm just going to tell you, you get no excuses on this one. You contact them whatever way you want to and in whatever time you want to, but you have to start contacting people. So I like to contact through email first, and here's why. I can say all the things I need to say in one email, and then I can put a little job description at the bottom, and I can say, would you pray about it? I don't like to ask people for a yes or no right away on the phone or in person, and here's why. People always say no if they're pressed for an answer, and they won't take time to think about it. We're all busy. And so if you come up to me today and you ask me to jump in on your project, I'm going to tell you no because I'm busy. But if you send me an email and say, hey, here's what's going on, can we talk about this sometime next week? Then I have time to think about it and really process what I'm saying yes to. So I like the email, and I can send it during dinner time. I can send it at 4 a.m. It doesn't matter. I'm not constrained by feeling like I'm intruding on someone's life. So you send your first contact. Don't ask for a yes or no. Ask if they would pray about it and if you could contact them the next week to talk about it. Then you actually have to contact them. So
don't forget to do that. That would be
if bad. You don't contact them, you'll never get volunteers. You're right. You have to keep the ball in your court so you don't feel awkward about continuing to contact. I know of someone who was a new person in a church, and they had just joined the church and they wanted to volunteer with the youth. And the student pastor came and talked to him and said, hey, we'd love to have you volunteer. And he said, okay, let me pray about it. And he was ready to say yes and didn't get contacted for 6 months. And he was ready. He was sitting there ready to say yes, but it wasn't the most important thing on his radar. And so you may have some yeses out there waiting for you to say, okay, let's get you scheduled. But they're not, no matter how well-intentioned they are, they're probably not going to contact you unless they're a really close friend.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you contact them again if you don't hear back? What do you think? What's your recommendation there? Like you put the seed out there, you ask the question, I'm going to reach out, then I reach out, and then I don't hear back. Do you contact them one more time?
I would contact them 3 or 4 times. And then on the 3rd or 4th time, I might say something like, hey, I haven't heard back from you, which makes me think this might not be a good fit for you. If there's another reason and you still want to talk about it, let me know. But I think 4 follow-ups eventually someone will tell you no if they really don't want to do it.
Me. Yeah, stop bugging
me. Right. And you can word things in a way that's, like you can be funny about it and be like, so I haven't heard from you. I hope you're okay. So either A, you're stuck under something, B, you really don't want to do this, or C, you just haven't had time to answer my email. Mm-hmm. And, just continuing to follow up until you get a no. And then once you get a no or a yes, then you kind of, if they're a yes, then I like to put them in bold in my little spreadsheet. If they're a no, I take their name out and I put my second choice in, and then I go through the same process. So you see why this takes a little time.
Yeah, and I noticed, I don't think I picked up on that. Your approach is to be specific even to the role they're going to play in, as opposed to, and I'm sure people could go either way, but right. you actually looked at names and said, I think they'd be good here, and then they might be okay here, versus just a general list, and I'm just going to talk to them and then see where that leads.
Right. One of the things I've seen happen with that, I'm just going to talk to them, and I want the Lord to call them to a position, which is great. But most people are overwhelmed by that. And most people that I know in children's ministry accidentally found themselves there. And they accidentally started as a volunteer when someone said, hey, I think you'd be good with 4th and 5th graders.
Yep.
But when we say, hey, where do you think you want to serve? For someone who's not experienced in children's ministry, they don't know.
Yeah. I know a lot of churches, we do this too, where they do an observation time where you can kind of see everything. Because you're right, they would have no idea. Now, I'm sure that sometimes people can make a prospect list and then they have names they put on there. They don't even know them. Like maybe it's just they got it from the database or the church directory, like you mentioned. So I guess in that case, can you even put them near someone you don't even know, or is it just they sit here until you have a first conversation and then you think, oh well, maybe I think you might be a fit here.
Yeah, I think I would invite them to a conversation. And I think I would also have a couple of places in mind that I wanted them to think about. And you can always say, hey, if none of these are a fit, I've got plenty of other places, but these are the first 2 that came to mind. Kind of give them a little choice. But I think just inviting them into a conversation about ministering to kids is a good way to start with someone you don't know. Another thing that I think we do a lot is we might pull the 1st grade roster and look at 1st grade parents and see if any of those are interested in serving in 1st grade. And I think that's perfectly fine to do too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking at what we talked about, and we had 4 other things we were going to hit, but if we run out of time, before we wrap up, I want you to explain a concept in this book. It's also in the Sustainable Youth Ministry, or maybe if it's not in there, it's in the other book about the 30-day change project, like a book about recruiting volunteers. Is this idea of balcony time? What is balcony time and how can we use it in our week to help us lead?
Yeah, balcony time is in Sustainable Children's Ministry, and it's a concept. It's kind of a little metaphor of we want to sit on the balcony of our ministry and kind of look at everything in a big picture sense. And so we recommend having balcony time every week. And so I know you're like, what is balcony time, Annette? So here's what's happening in your balcony time. You might be in your office or go to a coffee shop or, find a place where you can sit and think and really pray about your ministry and the direction that it's going. Part of that is going to be looking at your calendar and seeing what's happening in the next 3 months and just kind of thinking and planning about those things. And then taking a longer look at what's in the next 6 months and, what events are coming up, maybe what volunteers you may need to recruit. Are there any new things you want to try? And then taking a look at the next year and just getting that high level view, getting out of the weeds for an hour or so and really praying about the direction, praying about themes for events, thinking about who you may want to involve in those things. Sometimes we just get in the weeds. We don't get a chance to back up and think of new people to get involved, new ideas to try. There may be some blogs that you want to look at or things like that, but it's time when you're not editing curriculum, you're not calling volunteers, you're not cleaning out your classrooms, you're not reorganizing your resource room, but you're really thinking about the mission and the vision for your ministry and how each program fits into that.
That's good. We don't do enough of that, I don't think. So tell us, I wish we could have talked about all the other things in the book. There's a whole section that I'll just tease about the machines of children's ministry, like the systems, I guess you could call it, behind the scenes. And even what I liked reading through them was just a reminder of, wow, this really is a bunch of different systems and processes that you really have to have an intentional plan for each one of them, And sometimes you do for some, and then others it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's sort of a system. Yeah. It's sort of how we just figure it out when we need to. But that whole thing was great. How can people get the book? And then how can they get in touch with you if they have any questions or if they want to work with ministry architects?
Sure. You can get the book on Amazon, Sustainable Children's Ministry, and it's pretty easy to find. And then if you want to get in touch with me, my email is annette.safstrom@ministryarchitects.com. Or you can go through our website, ministryarchitects.com. If you're interested in, kind of seeing some of the coaching and other things that we do, then you can go that way. Either way, you can get in touch with me through either one of those venues.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much for the work you do with Ministry Architects to help churches. I'm passionate about that. I think that's awesome. And the book, which is very much needed. I think a lot of children's ministry leaders run in an unsustainable pace, an unsustainable ministry. So that's really, really helpful. And I just love how I'm a big fan of books like that in ministry that are very specific, practical, in the weeds kind of thing. I like both. I like the kind of philosophy or strategy or principles or whatever. Sure. But I also like books like this where it's like, oh, this is very specific. I can just go do this, right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Do this week and do that next week and make some real progress. So, thanks for taking the time and for coming on the podcast.
All right. Thank you. It was great to be here.
Well, that was really helpful. I love the work that Ministry Architects does, trying to help children's and student ministries. I mean, obviously, that's what this podcast is about. That's why Kevin and Kenny and I started Ministry Boost. I just think we need more and more resources and coaching and things like this to help those of us who lead in children's and student ministries. I think that's really important. Here are a few things I think of coming out of that interview that you could do. One certainly is to get the book. Most of you are probably going to be interested in the benchmarks that we talked about. So you already heard that. That's also in the book. But there's so much more to the book than that. Even the sections on recruiting and the process for that. And we talked about the balcony day and all that stuff. I think that's all really helpful. So get that, implement some of that. Download the survey that I mentioned that churches have taken so you can see, if you haven't done that before, where does your church stack up? Are you understaffed, overstaffed compared to the average church your size? Do you have more volunteers, less volunteers, whatever that might be. I just think there's value in the data that, tells you a little bit about reality so that it's not just what you're feeling or sensing in your own church in a vacuum. And then the third thing I think you could do is with the book and with that survey data, just create a simple plan. What are the 2 or 3 things that I'm going to do over the next month or two with this information? Am I going to go to leadership and talk about staffing? Or does staffing look okay, even though it doesn't feel okay? So I'm going to lean into the volunteer thing and really recruit heavily there. What's it going to be? I think you don't want to just get the information, from the book and the survey. You want to use it to make some key decisions and change your ministry going forward. So I mentioned in the beginning, but if you're interested in coaching with Orange and with Ministry Boost partnered together, we have, I think, another maybe 30 slots left or something. And so Orange extended the deadline till October 31st. Bunch of free tribe conversations. And then for people who are in coaching, there's a webinar in the middle of the month on the 17th and then a Q&A with Kara Powell on the 24th. You can get all the information you need about that at ministryboost.org/coaching or Orange's site, ylcoaching.com. Well, that's it. That's it for this week. Hope it was helpful for you, especially those of you who are leading in children's ministry and thinking about, where's my ministry in terms of health with staff and volunteers and with budget. I hope that was really helpful. As always, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, if you have suggestions for a topic that we could talk about, that would be really helpful. And I appreciate when you leave a rating and a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might listen to this. So hope it was helpful. Hope you have a great week, and I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.